They say every man has a moment when he stops running from his past and starts riding toward it. For Slate Calloway, that moment did not arrive with ceremony or warning or any of the dramatic signals a man might expect after 68 years of accumulated living. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March when the California desert air still held the bite of winter, and the garage smelled of motor oil and cold coffee, and a 79-year-old woman stepped out of a taxi with $40 in her purse and a dream that should have died in the Iraqi desert 33 years ago. But before that Tuesday, before the $40 and the dream, and the woman with eyes the color of a winter sky, there was a Monday. And before that Monday could make any sense at all, you had to go back further still. You had to go back to the beginning of the thing, to the courthouse steps in Sacramento, where the rain came down in cold gray curtains and the sound of 97 Harley-Davidson engines filled the air like the voice of something ancient finally deciding to speak. That was Monday, March 17th, 2024, 9 in the morning. The Sacramento Federal Courthouse sat at the corner of I and 7th, a building made of granite and institutional certainty designed by people who believed that power should look permanent. On most Monday mornings, it received its visitors quietly. Lawyers with briefcases, clerks with coffee cups and manila folders, the occasional defendant who climbed those broad stone steps with the careful gait of someone who understood that the next few hours might determine the shape of everything that followed. This Monday was not most Mondays. They heard the motorcycles before they saw them, a distant rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the air itself, from somewhere below. Conscious thought where the body registers sound before the mind has time to name it. People on the sidewalk stopped walking. A court officer standing by the main entrance straightened instinctively, his hand moving toward his belt before he understood why. Then they came around the corner. 97 Harley-Davidsons moving in two perfect columns, taking both lanes of 7th Street without apology and without hurry. They were not speeding. They were not performing. They were simply moving the way a river moves, with the quiet certainty of something that has decided where it is going and cannot be redirected. The riders wore leather vests and weathered faces, in the particular expression of men who have long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Their average age was 67. Their combined years on the road stretched back across more decades than most of the courthouse staff had been alive. They parked in formation along the street, engines cutting off one by one until the last one went silent and the sudden quiet was almost louder than the sound had been. A woman stood at the top of the courthouse steps. She was small, 5'3", in practical walking shoes, wearing a cream cardigan despite the March chill, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun. She held a metal box against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you cannot afford to lose. The box was old military issue, dented and scratched, the paint worn down to bare metal in the places where it had been handled most often. Stamped on the front in faded letters that had been worn nearly smooth by decades of opening and closing. She was 79 years old. She had been waiting 33 years for this morning, and whatever fear lived inside her did not show in her face. A man climbed off the lead motorcycle. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone whose body had logged enough miles and absorbed enough damage to know that unnecessary motion was a form of waste. He was 68 years old, 6'2", with iron gray hair kept close, and hands that were scarred and calloused and stained in the creases with traces of oil that no amount of washing had ever fully lifted. He wore a leather vest over a dark shirt, and on that vest were patches that told a long story to anyone who knew the language. His name was Slate Calloway. He walked up the courthouse steps through the misting rain. When he reached the woman at the top, he did not say anything. Neither did she. There was nothing left to say. He put his hand briefly on her arm, the lightest possible pressure, the kind of touch that says, "I am here," without requiring words. Then they walked through the doors together. And 97 men stood in the rain and waited, because that is what brothers do. The narrator's voice, when it came, had the cadence of a man who has learned that the most important things do not need to be said quickly. 33 years. That is how long a promise can wait when there is no one left to keep it. My father made his promise in January of 1991 in a bar in Oceanside, California, over beers with a man he had known for 3 years and trusted with his life on more occasions than he bothered to count. The promise was simple, the way the most important promises always are. If one of them didn't come home from the Gulf, the other would take care of the family left behind. They both died. February 10th, 1991. The same minefield. The same morning. 2 hours and 13 minutes apart. The promise died with them, or so everyone believed. I am not a man who searches for signs or reads intention into coincidence. I am a man who believes in engines and asphalt and the open road and keeping your word and not much else beyond that. But I will tell you this. When a 79-year-old woman walks into your garage on a Tuesday morning and puts two crisp $20 bills on your workbench, and when you look at her hand and see a ring that connects her to a man who died alongside your father in the same patch of Iraqi desert on the same day of the same year, you stop believing in coincidence. You start believing in something else entirely. You start believing that some promises don't die. They just wait. 24 hours before 97 Harleys surrounded the Sacramento federal courthouse. 24 hours before Slate Calloway stood on those granite steps and read aloud from a letter that a dead Marine had written 33 years ago to a son he had never met. 24 hours before all of that, it was just Tuesday. Tuesday, March 7th, 2024. 5 in the morning. Reading, California. The garage sat at the far edge of town where the streets gave up trying to be organized and surrendered to dust and wide lots and the particular quiet that exists at the boundary between a place that has stopped trying and a landscape that was never tamed to begin with. The San Francisco mountains were visible on clear days, distant and self-contained, and the valley stretched flat and pale in every direction like something that had been pressed down by the weight of accumulated seasons. Slate Calloway had owned the garage for 15 years. He had been opening it at 5 in the morning for longer than that because 5 in the morning was when the world was quiet enough to be worth inhabiting, when the coffee was hot enough to justify the cold, and when the silence felt like something that belonged to him rather than something imposed from outside. He had been waking before dawn since the year he joined the Hells Angels at 23, since he discovered that the only reliable cure for the noise inside his head was the noise of an engine and the wind moving past him at speed on an empty road. 45 years of that particular medicine. He did not count the years anymore. The counting led to thoughts he had no use for before sunrise. His hand found the motorcycle before his eyes had fully adjusted to the garage lights. Muscle memory, the reaching, the settling of calloused palm against cold chrome. The motorcycle was a 1963 Harley-Davidson Panhead, and it occupied the center of the garage the way certain things occupy the center of the lives that contain them. Not as an object exactly, but as a reference point. Everything else in the room arranged itself in relation to it. The workbenches, the tool chests, the oil-stained floor mats, the single high window that let in the early light at the precise angle he had been expecting for 15 years. He had bought this bike in 1976 with money earned loading lumber at a mill 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for 4 months. He had been 20 years old, broke, and certain that freedom was something you could acquire with enough work and the right machine. He had not been entirely wrong about that. He had also not been entirely right. The chrome was cold under his hand. The tank carried a small dent near the cap left by a bottle at a party in Bakersfield in 1982. Every scratch on that bike was a story he could still recite. Every dent was a date on a calendar that existed only in his memory. Every mile the odometer had turned was a piece of his life written in steel rather than words. He stood there in the cold garage light, just breathing. Then he crossed to the workbench. The coffee was already made. He had set the timer the night before, as he did every night, because some routines are the framework that holds everything else up, and you do not examine them, you simply maintain them. He poured a cup and set it at the corner of the bench and reached for the object that had no legitimate business on a motorcycle mechanic's workbench and had been there every morning for 33 years anyway. A dog tag, stainless steel worn smooth in the way of things that have been carried in pockets and held in hands through the long, sleepless hours when a man is left alone with the things he cannot change. He held it to the window light and read the words he had memorized long before reading them became unnecessary. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Calloway, USMC, 1968 to 1991. His father, dead 33 years this coming February. Desert Storm, the first Gulf War, a theater of conflict that the country had largely filed away under the heading of victory and moved past the way you move past things that cost you something real, but not quite enough to stop what you were doing. Frank Calloway had given that war the last of his 23 years of service completely, and without reservation, the way a man gives something when he understands it is the last thing he has to give. He had promised to come home. Slate set the dog tag back on the workbench with the deliberate care some men reserve for objects of faith and turned to look at the other motorcycle. It sat in the far corner of the garage like something that had lost faith in its own usefulness. A 1963 Panhead identical in model year to his own, but where his was maintained and loved back into something close to its original purpose, this one was a catalog of long neglect. The tank was rusted through in 3 places, the corrosion eating through the metal in irregular patterns. The engine was seized, its internal components fused together by years of sitting still in varying temperatures without lubrication or attention. The leather seat had cracked and curled at the edges, all the suppleness dried out of it by seasons of alternating cold nights and brutal California sun. 2 weeks ago, he had placed an advertisement in the local paper. He had not seriously expected anyone to respond. The price in the ad was $40 because $40 was exactly what he had paid for his first real toolbox in 1976 when he was young and broke and believed completely in the power of having the right tools for a problem. $40 was a number that meant something to him in a private language with no other speakers. Nobody buys a seized, rusted panhead for $40. Nobody with any practical sense, anyway. He had been wrong about that. The taxi arrived at 11 in the morning. He was beneath the 1972 shovelhead, at the time replacing a head gasket that had surrendered 2 days prior, and he heard the car door close with enough force to carry through the corrugated metal walls and reach him through the frame of the bike above. He slid out on the creeper, wiped his hands on a rag that had long ago given up the concept of clean, and stepped into the sharp white glare of the California midday. The woman who had stepped out of the taxi was contained in the way of people who have learned to occupy exactly the space they need without reaching for more. Perhaps 5'3" in low-heeled shoes built for function rather than impression. A cream cardigan over a pale blouse despite the heat already pushing toward 90 degrees. A purse older than most of his motorcycles. White hair in a neat bun with the practiced precision of someone who had been doing it the same way for 40 years. She was paying the driver. She counted the bills with the careful attention of a person for whom each dollar represented something earned, then turned toward the garage. Her eyes moved past him, past the shovelhead and the tool chests and the coffee cups and everything else in the building, straight to the rusted panhead in the far corner as though she had been looking for it for a long time and was registering now that the looking was over. Then she looked at him. He had been looked at by many people in 68 years. Looked at with fear, with wariness, with the careful assessment of law enforcement, with the specific quality of appraisal that strangers applied to men of his size and appearance. He had been looked at with admiration and contempt and occasional love. He had not often been looked at the way this woman looked at him. Her eyes were the blue of a winter sky after the clouds have moved through and left the air scrubbed clean. Sharp and direct, and carrying the accumulated weight of someone who had seen a great deal and filed all of it away without distortion. It was the gaze of a person who was not easily surprised by what the world chose to present. "Is that the one from the advertisement?" she said. Her voice was steady and clear, the remnant of an East Coast accent that decades in California had softened at the edges without removing from the vowels. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am, $40. She walked past him into the garage without waiting for an invitation, moving with the careful grace of someone navigating a body that required more negotiation than it once had, but who refused to let that requirement become the defining fact about her. She stopped in front of the rusted panhead and looked at it the way people look at graves or at photographs of people who are gone with something that was recognition rather than grief, an acknowledgement of presence rather than absence. Slate followed her inside, still working the rag over his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to be straight with you before you make any decisions. That engine is completely seized. The tank is rusted through in multiple places. The electrical system needs to be replaced from the ground up. This isn't something you ride away on next week or next month. It needs serious work from someone who knows what they're doing." She was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on the rusted tank, her fingers tracing the ghost of the Harley Davidson logo beneath the corrosion. "My husband promised me a ride," she said. She said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and does not require emphasis to carry its weight. Route 66, she continued without looking at him. Chicago to Los Angeles, 2,448 miles. He found a panhead just like this one at an estate sale in Sacramento in 1989 and brought it home in a borrowed truck and spent 6 months restoring it in our garage. He said when he retired from the Marines, when he had done his 20 years and earned his pension, we would take 2 weeks and just ride. No schedule, no plans, no destination except the road and each other. Her fingers stilled on the tank. "He didn't retire," she said. Her voice went quieter, the quiet of someone managing something large with practiced skill. Desert Storm, February of 1991. Lieutenant Corbett Harmon, United States Marine Corps. He came home in a flag-draped box instead of on a motorcycle. They buried him in Sacramento National Cemetery with full military honors, while I stood there 8 months pregnant with our son and tried to understand how the rest of the world could keep moving when mine had stopped completely. The air left Slate's lungs. He said nothing because nothing he could say would improve on the silence the moment had already created. He stood in the oil-scented air of the garage and let the information settle into him, And as it settled, he understood that something had shifted in the room in the morning, in the ordinary fabric of a Tuesday that had begun like every other Tuesday and was now something else entirely. Desert Storm, February of 1991. The same war, the same month, the same coordinates on the calendar that marked the worst morning of his own life, when his mother's voice had come through the walls of their other house in Reading at 6:30 in the morning, and he had run downstairs and found her in the kitchen with the phone in one hand and his father's last letter in the other. And the sound she was making was the sound of a world ending. The woman turned to look at him. There were tears in her eyes. She had not allowed them to fall. And Slate understood, looking at her face, that she had developed over 33 years a specific and hard-won ability to hold things inside that other people would have set down long ago. 28 years I waited, she said, too frightened, too angry, too broken even to sit on a motorcycle. And then I woke up 3 months ago on my 79th birthday and understood that if I don't take this ride, if I don't do the thing Corbett promised me, then I never will. And I will have failed him one more time. So here I am, with $40 and a dream that should have ended in the Iraqi desert but somehow did not. She opened her purse and removed two $20 bills. They were new, precisely creased, the kind you get when you go to a bank specifically for the purpose, because the transaction matters enough to do it with clean money. She held them out with the composure of someone offering something that cost them more than the number on the bills. Slate did not take them. He was looking at her other hand, at the rings on her finger which had caught the light coming through the garage door and sent it somewhere behind his sternum, a plain gold wedding band worn thin by decades of daily contact, and above it a second ring heavier silver and gold. The eagle globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps worked into the face of it, the emblem worn smooth by the same decades of handling that had worn everything else smooth. On the band's interior edge, just visible in the slant of morning light, an inscription. He had seen that inscription before. Not this ring, a different ring. In a photograph his father had kept in his wallet, through 3 wars and 2 decades away from home, a photograph Slate had found when he went through Frank's personal effects in the weeks after the funeral. 2 men in desert camouflage with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at a camera with the complete confidence of people who believe in this precise moment that they are indestructible. His mouth had gone dry. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out with a roughness he had not put into it. "That ring, where did it come from?" She looked down at her hand with the expression of someone who has worn something so long they sometimes forget it is there. "My husband," she said, "returned with his personal effects after he died. I have worn it every day since February 12th, 1991. She paused. "Why do you ask?" "The inscription," Slate said. "May I see it?" She removed the ring slowly with the deliberateness of removing something that is also a piece of yourself and held it out to him. He took it in his scarred hands and held it to the light from the doorway and read the words engraved inside the band. The letters were small and worn, but legible. "Bravo Company, 1968 to 1991. The room shifted, not physically. Nothing moved. But something changed in the quality of the air in the garage, in the character of the silence, in the particular weight of this Tuesday morning that had begun like any other and was no longer anything like any other. Bravo Company, his father's unit, the same company Frank Calloway had served with for the last 3 years of his life. Slate's hand went to his back pocket without a conscious decision to send it there. A reflex from 40 years of the same gesture, the same ritual, whenever his mind traveled to the place where his father lived in permanent residence. He drew out his wallet, battered leather he had carried since 1985, and from the billfold extracted a photograph. He had carried this photograph for 33 years. It had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were soft and the color had faded to the pale wash tones of old film, but the image was still clear enough to read. 2 men in desert camouflage with their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera, with the abandon of people who have survived enough together to believe the surviving will continue. On the back, in his father's tight and careful handwriting, "Me and Corbett, best damn Marine I ever served with. Kuwait, January 91. Corbett, Lieutenant Corbett Harmon." He turned the photograph over and held it out to her. She took it, and the sound she made, it was barely a sound, a breath that collapsed partway through into something that her 33 years of practiced composure could not entirely contain. A small and involuntary fracture in the careful structure she had built. "Corbett," she said, "just the name, just the word, barely above a whisper." She looked at the photograph the way people look at things they had been certain were gone from the world. "He talked about your father constantly," she said when she had found her voice again, "in his letters home, in the satellite phone calls when he could get through. He said Frank Calloway was the finest man he had ever served with." Said Frank had saved his life twice in that deployment and would probably do it again before they made it back. He said she paused, organizing the words she had held for 3 decades. He said, if anything ever happened to him, Frank would take care of us. That Frank would honor the promise Corbett couldn't. They looked at each other across the concrete floor of the garage in the white midday light, with the smell of oil and cold coffee around them and 33 years of loss between them that had turned out on this ordinary Tuesday morning to be a connection rather than a division. They both died, she said. February 10th, 1991, 4:17 in the morning, California time. The base chaplain called me. He said Corbett and another Marine had stepped into an unmarked minefield during a reconnaissance mission near the Kuwaiti border. Both killed instantly. He said it was quick. He said Corbett did not suffer. I have never been certain whether that was true or whether it is simply what chaplains are taught to tell the women who answer the phone at strange hours. Slate was very still. My father, he said. Frank Calloway. He was the other Marine. Her hand went to her mouth. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fell to the concrete floor without a sound. Neither of them moved for a moment. The garage held them both in its ordinary silence, which had become a very different kind of silence, the kind that forms around significant things the way water forms around stone. Slate bent and picked up the photograph. He looked at his father's face. Frank Calloway had been 46 years old when he died. 22 years younger than Slate was standing in this building right now. In the photograph, he was grinning at the camera with his arm around Corbett Harmon, and both of them looked like men who had never seriously entertained the possibility of a world that did not contain them. He handed the photograph back. Your husband and my father, he said. Same company, same deployment, the same minefield on the same morning, 2 hours and 13 minutes apart. Vera's face had gone through several things in the preceding 30 seconds and had arrived at something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but contained elements of both the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a mystery for a long time and has just received a piece of it they did not know was missing. He talked about a boy, she said quietly. In his letters, Frank's son, he said the boy couldn't serve because of an injury. He said it was the only thing that seemed to sit wrong with Frank, that his son couldn't follow him into the Corps. But then he said something else. He said Frank told him the boy was building something honest with what he had, and that was its own kind of service. Slate said nothing. He was thinking about 1983, his father home on leave, 3 days in the garage with wrenches and carburetors in a silence between them that was not empty, but full of things neither of them had found the words for. His father had not offered consolation about the medical exemption or perspective about alternative paths. He had simply handed his son a wrench and pointed at a problem and let the work do what words could not. On the second day, without looking up from the engine they were rebuilding together, Frank had said, "A man is only as strong as his word, son. Everything else shifts. Your word is the one thing that is entirely yours to decide about." Slate had not responded. He had been 23 and angry at everything that year, and his father had not been exempt from the general anger. His father had not required a response. He had just kept working. In the garage in Reading on a Tuesday morning, 33 years later, Slate Calloway understood something about that moment that he had not understood before. His father had not needed him to be a Marine. His father had needed him to understand what mattered. The rest was detail. He looked at Vera Harmon. He made a decision. The kind that does not announce itself with deliberation or argument, but arrives complete the way his father's hand must have moved when he turned around in that minefield, simply, certainly, with no hesitation and no consultation, with the part of the mind that calculates personal cost. The bike is worth $4,000, Slate said. Maybe $5 once the work is done. The $40 in the advertisement was a mistake. I meant to write $4,000. He watched her face change, the light going out of it in the particular way of someone who had prepared themselves for disappointment and was now experiencing the confirmation of what they had feared. She began to fold the $20 bills back into her purse. I understand, she said. I am sorry to have wasted your time. But Slate said, one word. It stopped her. I am selling it to you for $40. Exactly what the advertisement said. On one condition. She looked at him with those winter sky eyes. I teach you to ride it first, he said. 3 weeks of lessons, 2 hours every morning. You learn this machine properly the way your life will depend on it when you are on it, because it will. You learn the weight and the balance and the way it talks back to every input. And when you have demonstrated that you can handle it safely, we restore it together. You and me, every bolt and every wire and every piece of chrome, the way your husband would have done it. And when it is ready, when it is everything it should be, you take that ride. Route 66, Chicago to Los Angeles. Every mile he promised you. She looked at him for a long moment, at his face, at the garage around them, at the rusted panhead behind her patient in its corner. Why would you do that? She said. I am a stranger who answered an advertisement. Slate picked up his father's dog tag from the workbench and held it briefly in his hand, then set it down again. Because my father and your husband made a promise to each other, he said, before they deployed, before the desert. If one of them didn't make it back, the other would take care of the family left behind. Make sure they were okay. Make sure they knew they were loved. He looked at her steadily. They both died, so neither of them could keep it. But I can keep it for them. 33 years late, but I can still keep it. He held out his hand. It was not an elegant hand. It was calloused and scarred and permanently marked by 4 decades of engine work and road miles and the accumulated evidence of a life lived at close range with things that required real effort. But it was honest, and at 68 years old, he had come to believe that honest was the primary qualification. Vera Harmon looked at his hand, then at his face, then at the panhead in the corner waiting with the particular patience of something that has been waiting long enough to have made peace with the waiting. She set her purse on the workbench beside Frank Calloway's dog tag. She reached inside and removed a small metal box. Old. Military issue, the kind designed to keep paper dry in conditions that were not sympathetic to paper. The lid was dented and scratched and worn to bare metal in the spots where it had been gripped most often. The hinges were solid despite the years, stamped on the front in faded letters pressed deep enough that the decades had not erased them. Bravo Company, 1968 to 1991. Before we shake on it, Vera said, her voice measured and careful, there is something you need to know. Something I have not told anyone, not my neighbors, not my attorney, not even my son. She opened the box with the steadiness of long practice. Inside, arranged with a precision that suggested they had found their permanent places over many years of being taken out and looked at and returned, were 3 objects. A Purple Heart medal in its original blue presentation case, the service ribbon still bright against the lining. A folded letter yellowed and softened at the creases by the number of times it had been unfolded and read and folded again. And a second letter still sealed in its envelope with words written across the front in neat block capitals. To the son of Frank Calloway, if I don't make it home. The garage was very quiet. Slate reached for the sealed letter with hands that wanted to be unsteady, but were not, because steadiness was something his hands had learned as a professional requirement over 4 decades, and they did not easily unlearn it. Vera pulled it back gently, just out of reach. Not yet, she said. There are things in that letter you need to know. But first I need you to hear what I came here to tell someone. What Corbett asked me in his last letter to do. What I have been too frightened and too angry and too exhausted to do for 28 years. He waited. Outside, the highway traffic moved in its ordinary way, indifferent to what was happening in this building. My son, Vera said, is trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. The words fell into the space between them and changed the temperature of the room. He has a doctor, she continued, a psychiatrist in San Francisco, board certified, Stanford Medical School. This doctor has produced a report stating that I have Alzheimer's disease. Early stage but progressing. My son has lawyers and documentation and expert testimony and a court date 10 days from now. He intends to have me placed in a care facility and to take control of my assets through a conservatorship petition. She looked at Slate without flinching. Those assets include a 22-acre ranch in Shasta County worth $3.1 million. Land that has been in Corbett's family since his great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1887. 4 generations of that family worked that land and built on it and are buried near it. Corbett's father planted the north orchard by hand. Corbett built the fence along the lower meadow the summer before he enlisted. That land is not a financial asset. It is everything he was and everything he came from, and my son wants to sell it to a development corporation so they can build a golf resort. The chill that settled in Slate's chest was familiar. The particular cold that precedes a fight, not fear, but the body's recognition that something significant is about to be required of it. Do you have Alzheimer's disease, he said. No. She said it without heat or defensiveness, with the flat certainty of someone who has examined the question from every angle and arrived at the same answer each time. I can tell you the name of every man in Corbett's platoon and tell you which ones came home, she said. I can recite his service number from memory. I can tell you what I had for breakfast on any morning of the past month. I can recall the exact words Corbett said to me the last time I saw him before he deployed. I remember everything. Everything except how to stop my own son from using my grief as a legal instrument. Her voice shifted then, something harder entering it, the quality of metal that has been through fire and come out changed. The diagnosis is fabricated. My son arranged it. Dr. Aldous Merritt, board-certified geriatric psychiatrist, Stanford Medical School, spent 30 minutes with me and charged my son $75,000 to write a report saying I have Alzheimer's disease when I do not. And if I cannot prove it in 10 days, I lose the ranch. I lose my freedom. I lose the last thing Corbett died protecting. Slate said, "Why would your son do that?" Money. The word arrived without hesitation, bitter, as something that has been held long enough to ferment. My son is a real estate attorney in San Francisco. Successful, or he presents that way. 2 years ago, his wife left and took half of everything in the settlement, and what remained has not been enough to sustain what he built his life around. He is leveraged in ways that have been keeping him awake at night, and he has already signed a contract to sell my ranch to a corporation called Cascade Development. They want to build a resort, golf course, spa, condominiums at $800,000 each. She looked at the tin box in her hands. Corbett's will is ironclad. The property cannot be sold while I am alive without my explicit consent or unless I am declared legally incompetent by a court. Briggs tried to persuade me to agree to the sale. He came to the ranch 3 times with presentations and projections and arguments about why selling would be the sensible choice. When I told him I would never sell Corbett's land, he stopped asking. 8 weeks later, he appeared at my door with Dr. Merritt and a diagnosis. Slate was quiet for a long moment. He thought about codes, the kind that existed beneath law older than statute, written not in books, but in the accumulated understanding of what it meant to be the kind of person others could stake something real on. You did not steal from family. You did not use the people who loved you as instruments for your own survival. You did not look at the grief of a widow and calculate how to convert it into leverage. You have proof the diagnosis is fraudulent, he said. Not yet, she said. But I know it is, and I will find it if I have time. 10 days. And I need someone who is not afraid of lawyers or money, or the kind of threats that men like my son are skilled at making. She looked at him directly. This woman who had stood in a cemetery 8 months pregnant and held everything together by sheer force of will for 28 years since. Someone who understands that sometimes the right thing is not the comfortable thing or the safe thing. Someone who knows that a promise is not a suggestion. Slate looked at the sealed letter in the tin box, at the block printing on the front, at the date on his father's dog tag, at the rusted panhead in the corner that had been waiting in this garage for the same reason all the other things had been waiting. He thought about the photograph in his wallet, his father's arm around Corbett Harmon's shoulders, both of them grinning like men who owned the morning and everything the morning contained. He thought about what it meant that his father had gone looking for a carburetor to rebuild in August of 1983 when his son was sitting in a garage full of anger with nowhere to put it. What it meant that Frank had not offered philosophy or reassurance, but simply handed over a wrench and started working. He thought about the kind of man his father had been, and about whether he had spent 68 years becoming that kind of man, or some other kind, and he understood that this was the question the morning had been moving toward since before he drove to the garage, since before the taxi arrived, since before the advertisement went into the paper, since perhaps February 10th, 1991, when 2 men died in the same minefield and left behind a promise with no one to carry it. Slate Calloway held out his hand for the second time. This time he did not say the word deal. He did not need to. Vera looked at his hand, at his face, at the dog tag on the workbench beside her tin box, at the sealed envelope in the box with her dead husband's words on the front of it, at the rusted panhead in the corner patient as everything that has learned to wait. She took his hand. Her grip was stronger than a stranger would have expected. The grip of someone who had been holding everything together for 28 years on the strength of what lived inside her, rather than what the world had provided, and whose hands had learned over all that time that letting go was not something they did without very good reason. "What kind of help?" she said. Slade almost smiled. It was not a comfortable expression on his face. It was the expression of a man who had been in the Hells Angels for 45 years and understood precisely what resources that represented when those resources were pointed at a problem. "The kind with motorcycles," he said. And that was the beginning. Not the beginning of a story exactly, though it was that too. The beginning of a debt being honored 33 years after it was incurred with the only currency that had ever mattered. The beginning of something that 2 men had set in motion in a bar in Oceanside in January of 1991 and had not lived long enough to finish. Behind Vera in his corner, the rusted panhead sat in the afternoon light. It had been waiting for 35 years. It would not have to wait much longer. The afternoon after Vera Harmon left in her taxi, Slate Calloway stood alone in the garage for a long time without doing anything in particular. He stood at the workbench with his cold coffee and his father's dog tag and the particular quality of silence that descends on a space after something significant has happened in it. The light through the high window had shifted into the low gold of late afternoon, catching the dust in the air and making it visible all those suspended particles that were always there but only became apparent when the angle was right. He looked at the rusted panhead in the corner. He had put it there 2 weeks ago on a whim, or what he had told himself was a whim, though he understood now that very few things that feel like whims are actually whims. They are decisions the deeper parts of you make before the thinking parts have caught up. You place an advertisement for a $40 motorcycle because somewhere underneath the surface of your ordinary life, you are waiting for something, and the $40 is a signal fire, a flare sent up into the dark in the hope that someone out there in the dark is watching for it. Someone had been watching. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not dialed in several months, and when the line connected, he did not waste time on preamble. "Fletcher Haynes," he said, "I need a favor." The voice on the other end was dry and unhurried. The voice of a man who had given up being in a rush sometime in his early 60s and had not missed the sensation. "How big a favor?" Doc said. "The kind that requires your medical opinion," Slate said. Unofficially. A pause. Then, with the careful precision of a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chose instruments, "Tell me what you're dealing with." Slate told him. "Not everything. Enough." He described Vera and the ranch and the son and the diagnosis and the court date 10 days away. He described the Stanford-credentialed psychiatrist and the $75,000 fee and the conservatorship petition that would strip a 79-year-old woman of the right to make her own decisions. He described the way she had held the tin box against her chest when Briggs arrived, like someone protecting something irreplaceable from a force that did not understand the concept of irreplaceable things. When he finished, Doc was quiet for a moment. "You want me to evaluate her," Doc said. "Tell me if she's got what that doctor says she's got." Fletcher Haynes had been a Navy corpsman in Desert Storm attached to a Marine unit doing battlefield medicine with whatever came to hand while the world exploded around him. He had come home in 1991 and gone to medical school on the GI Bill and practiced family medicine in Reading for 25 years before the woods outside Shasta Lake had called to him with an offer he finally couldn't refuse. The offer was silence and pine trees in the absence of paperwork. He had accepted. He was 69 years old and sharp as the day he graduated, and he owed Slate Calloway a favor that did not have a name because some favors are too large to be named. "Bring her tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. And Slate, if this diagnosis is what you think it is and I say so, I am putting my license on the line. I know what I'm asking. Do you?" "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. Then 8 o'clock. "Bring coffee. Mine is undrinkable." That night, in a high-rise office building in the San Francisco financial district, a man in an expensive suit made a phone call on his personal cell, the one that didn't connect to the firm's server. Briggs Harmon was 45 years old and looked like someone who had spent those years acquiring the visible markers of success and was now discovering at considerable personal cost that visible markers of success were not the same thing as an actual foundation. He was lean in the way of men who spent money on their bodies as a form of control. He wore his dark hair cut close and his jaw set hard, and his eyes moved in a room the way his father's eyes had moved in a room, always tracking exits, though for entirely different reasons. His father had tracked exits because he had been trained to survive. Briggs tracked exits because he was very good at leaving situations before they became problems, and he had built his entire professional life on this skill. The man who answered the phone was Dr. Aldous Merritt, board-certified geriatric psychiatrist, Stanford Medical School author of 3 peer-reviewed papers on cognitive decline in aging populations, and a private assessment practice that generated more revenue in a single month than most psychiatrists saw in a year. Merritt's voice when he answered carried the particular confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted himself. "Everything on schedule," he said without preamble. "Court date stands. The documentation is comprehensive." "My mother was in Reading today," Briggs said. There was a flatness in his voice, the controlled tone of a man managing something beneath the surface. "She bought a motorcycle from some garage mechanic. A panhead for $40. A pause. Then with mild interest, she bought a motorcycle. "She has a court date in 10 days, Aldous. A court date that establishes she is mentally incapable of making financial decisions. And she went and bought a motorcycle." "People with early-stage Alzheimer's can have periods of apparent lucidity," Merritt said. "This is documented." The mechanic, Briggs said. "I don't know who he is, but she was there for 3 hours." Silence on the line. Merritt said, "Make sure nothing is accessible that shouldn't be." "I'll need you solid on the stand," Briggs said. "I am always solid on the stand." Briggs ended the call and stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights below. He thought about the ranch. 4 generations of Harmon family history on 22 acres of Shasta County. His father's great-grandfather had built the main house in 1887 with lumber milled from the property itself, and the house had stood through earthquakes and droughts and floods and the casual indifference of time. The land was worth $3.1 million to Cascade Development and considerably more to the resort they intended to build on it, and Briggs had already spent the money in his head several times over in ways that would solve problems he had been managing for 2 years with diminishing success. He thought briefly about his father. Then he stopped. That particular line of thinking had never served him well, and he had learned in the 20 years since law school to redirect it with efficiency. His father was a photograph on a wall. His father was a name on a gravestone at Sacramento National Cemetery. His father was a concept that other people seemed to find meaningful, and that Briggs had decided at some point in his 30s he could not afford. He poured himself a drink and went to bed. Wednesday morning arrived in Redding with the particular indifference of a California March day that has not yet decided whether to be cold or warm and has settled on a gray compromise that pleases no one. Slate drove Vera to Fletcher Haynes's cabin outside Shasta Lake at 7:30, arriving in the pine-thick quiet of the mountain road with 30 minutes to spare and 2 cups of coffee from the gas station that were considerably better than Doc's. The cabin sat back from the road among ponderosa pines that were old enough to have witnessed several generations of human decisions and had formed no opinions about any of them. The lake was visible through the trees, flat and silver in the morning light. Doc met them on the porch. He was 69 and built like someone who had once been physically formidable and had since relocated to a quieter county, but retained the dimensions. His handshake with Vera was brief and careful, and the look he gave her over the handshake was professional and attentive without being clinical. He took them inside, and Slate sat in the main room with the tree bark coffee and the sound of Vera's steady voice through the wall and did not look at the clock more than twice. The evaluation took 2 hours. When Doc emerged, he poured himself the terrible coffee without saying anything, which Slate had learned years ago meant that the man was organizing his thoughts rather than avoiding a conclusion. He gestured toward the porch. They went outside. The lake was doing something with the morning light that made it look ancient. An osprey was working a thermal somewhere over the water, circling with the effortless patience of a creature that has no concept of urgency. "She is sharp as an attack dog," Doc said quietly. "Sharper than most people half her age. Her memory is precise. Her reasoning is sequential and clear. Her temporal orientation is perfect. Her abstract processing is excellent. There is no cognitive decline, no memory dysfunction, no confusion. Whatever Marcus Whitmore wrote in that assessment file, it is not based on anything he observed in this woman." Slate said nothing. "Because the diagnosis is fabricated," Doc said. "I cannot prove it without seeing Whitmore's actual examination notes and comparing them to what I just observed. But based on 2 hours with Ruth Harmon, I would stake my license on the fact that she does not have Alzheimer's disease. She does not have any form of dementia. She is one of the sharpest 79-year-olds I have encountered in 25 years of practice." Slate looked at the osprey. "Can you testify to that?" he said. "I can," Doc said. "But Slate, listen to me carefully. Whitmore has Stanford credentials and a published record and institutional credibility. If I go on the stand against him, they will spend half their time establishing that I am a retired family practice doctor living alone in the woods, and the other half finding every professional error I made in a quarter century of medicine to argue that my judgment cannot be trusted. They will make it ugly. Will they be right? No. But they will be convincing, which matters more in a courtroom." Doc looked at him. "What are you planning to do?" "What I have to," Slate said. Doc was quiet for a moment. The osprey found what it was looking for and folded and dropped with the absolute commitment of something that has calculated the physics and decided the risk is worth it. "Then I will write the evaluation," Doc said. "Formal language, proper documentation, everything admissible. Whatever use you can make of it." Slate put his hand briefly on the older man's shoulder, which was the nearest he came to expressions of gratitude in which Doc understood for exactly what it was. They drove back through the mountains in the middle of the morning, the road curving through pine and manzanita, with occasional views of open valley below. Vera sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the landscape with the expression of someone reacquainting themselves with a place they had been away from too long. Slate drove and did not push conversation. He was thinking about 1983. The memory arrived the way certain memories arrive in the presence of particular problems. Not because you summon them, but because the problem and the memory recognize each other. He was 19 in 1983, and his back had been broken for a year, and he was still angry about it in the consuming way of young men who have been denied the thing they were reaching for by a cause entirely beyond their control. The motorcycle accident had taken 3 vertebrae, and the ability to enlist and the particular future he had imagined for himself and what had been left after the surgery and the recovery was a young man with too much time and too much anger, and a father who came home on leave that August and stood in the garage with him for 3 days straight. Frank Calloway had not offered sympathy. He had not offered perspective or philosophy or any of the things that adults offer young men in lieu of what the young men actually need. He had simply handed his son a wrench and pointed at a carburetor that needed rebuilding and said nothing until the work demanded that something be said. On the second day working side by side in the shade of the garage with the heat pressing in from outside and the smell of oil and metal around them, Frank had said, "A man is only as strong as his word, son. Everything else changes. Money changes. Health changes. Circumstances change. Your word is the only thing that is entirely yours to control." Slade had not said anything. He had been angry at everything that year, and his father had not been exempt from the general anger. His father had not required a response. He had just kept working. The memory dissolved into the mountain road, and Slate drove, and the pines moved past the windows in their slow procession, and beside him Vera Harmon was quiet with her hands folded in her lap, carrying her 33 years of waiting with the practiced composure of someone who has learned that the alternative to composure is a kind of collapse from which it is difficult to return. "I want you to read the letter," she said. He glanced at her. "Not now," she said. "But as soon, before whatever you're planning to do." She was looking straight ahead at the road. "Because it changes things what Corbett wrote. It changes what you need to know about your father." Slate said nothing, but the weight of that sealed envelope was already present in the room between them, had been present since she had held it out and then pulled it back in the garage the day before. The letter that a dead Marine had addressed to the son of his dead best friend. The letter that had waited in a military tin box for 33 years, patient as the mountains, holding its particular truth in the dark. Thursday arrived cool and clear, the sky the particular blue of a California morning that has burned off the marine layer early and decided to be generous. Slate drove Vera up into Lassen National Forest in the early afternoon to a stretch of road that climbed through ponderosa pine at 5,000 feet and came out on a ridge with a view that extended to the snow-capped peak of Mount Lassen, and beyond it to the ranges that folded one behind the other into the distance until they became indistinguishable from the sky. He pulled off at a wide turnout where a stone wall ran along the edge of the drop and sat down on it and waited while Vera sat beside him and looked at the mountain. She had brought the tin box. She opened it without ceremony and removed the sealed envelope and held it for a moment, not looking at it, looking at the mountain. Then she held it out. The envelope was aged to a pale ivory. The block printing on the front was in the careful hand of someone who had learned to write clearly under conditions that did not favor clarity. The seal was intact, 33 years of not being opened. Slate took it. He held it for a long moment. Then he broke the seal, the way you break something that has been preserved carefully, with the understanding that what you are doing cannot be undone. He unfolded the paper inside. The writing on it was neat and precise. The letters formed with the discipline of a man who believed that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly, even when the thing was a letter written in a forward operating area with sand and everything, and the sound of artillery somewhere to the north. February 8th, 1991. To the son of Frank Calloway, if you are rereading this. If you are reading this, then your father and I did not make it back from Iraq. I am sorry for that. Sorrier than I can say in a letter. Sorrier than any word that exists in any language I know. Your father talked about you constantly, every night in the tent, every morning over coffee that tasted like the sand it was filtered through, every quiet hour when we weren't actively trying not to get killed. He talked about you with the particular pride of a man who knows he has done something right and cannot stop marveling at it. He talked about the accident and about your back and about the door that closed for you, and he talked about how you had taken what was left after the door closed and built something honest with it. He said you had more of him in you than you knew, and that you would understand what he meant by that eventually. We made a promise to each other, Frank and I. We made it the night before we deployed over beers in a bar in Oceanside that I could not now tell you the name of. If one of us didn't come home, the survivor would take care of the other's family. Make sure they were okay. Make sure they knew they were loved. Make sure they understood that the man who died was thinking of them at the end. If you are rehiding this, we both failed that promise. We are both gone. So I am asking you, as the only person Frank trusted with his deepest loyalties, to do what we couldn't. Take care of my Vera. Take care of our son, who will be born 3 months after I die and who I will never get to meet. There is something you need to know about the day we died. On February 10th, we were scheduled for a reconnaissance mission near the Kuwaiti border. Intelligence suggested Iraqi units retreating through the sector. Probably routine. I wrote this letter before we went because some part of me felt the weight of what was coming, the way you sometimes feel weather before it arrives. I stepped on a mine. I felt it click under my boot. I knew what it meant. Your father was 20 feet ahead of me. He could have kept walking, should have kept walking. There was no logical reason in the world for a man to turn around and come back toward a triggered mine, except one, and the reason was not logical at all. He came back. He spent 14 minutes trying to find a way to get me off that mine without detonating it. 14 minutes, I know because I counted every one of them, and he knew from the first second what the odds were. He knew it the way men who have trained for 23 years know things in the bone below thought. He came back anyway, because that was who Frank Calloway was. A man who kept his word, even when keeping his word meant dying. I hope you are like him, your father's friend, Lieutenant Corbett Harmon, USMC. Slate read the letter 3 times. The mountains sat across the valley from them, indifferent and permanent, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like the ocean heard from a distance, and the sky above was the blue of something immaculate and unhurried. He folded the letter with great care and returned it to its envelope. He didn't retire, Slate said, his voice rough. He didn't survive and stop. He went back into it. He chose to, Vera said quietly. 14 minutes. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then he could have survived. There was no order given, no regulation that required it. He simply could not leave Corbett on that mine and walk away. 33 years, Slate said. 33 years I thought I had let him down. Because I couldn't follow him. Because the door was closed and I never got to wear the uniform, and I thought that was the thing that mattered to him. The service, the continuity. 3 generations of Calloway men in the military, and I was the one who broke it. He looked at the mountain. But he didn't need that from me, Slate said. He just needed me to be the kind of man who comes back. Vera reached over and placed her hand on his. Her skin was warm and thin, the texture of something that had weathered a great deal and was stronger for it. They sat like that for a while, 2 people on a stone wall at 5,000 feet, with the mountain in front of them and the dead between them, and the afternoon light going long and gold across the valley below. When Slate spoke again, his voice had changed. Whatever softness had been in it was still there, but underneath it now was something harder. Not cold, more like iron that has been through fire and has become what it is going to be permanently. I need to make a call tonight, he said. Vera nodded once. She knew. She had known in the way of someone who has been around men like this her entire life that the call would come, that the machinery of whatever was going to happen would begin to move. That night, somewhere in the city of San Francisco, Briggs Harmon met Dr. Aldous Merritt at a restaurant that did not appear on Yelp and accepted reservations only by personal introduction. The room was designed for discretion, booths with high backs lighting low enough to render features indistinct, a noise level calibrated to absorb conversation without producing it. Merritt was 57 and looked like a man who had organized his appearance the way he organized his professional documentation comprehensively, with attention to the details that would be noticed first. His salt and pepper hair was precisely cut. His suit was charcoal and correct. He had the kind of face that photographs well in institutional contexts and inspires confidence in people who are predisposed to extend confidence to faces that look like his. He was a silent partner in Cascade Development Corporation, had been for 4 years. His initial investment of $2.3 million had been drawn from the fees he had collected for professional services in guardianship and conservatorship cases across Northern California. He had a gift for diagnosis. Specifically, he had a gift for producing diagnoses that matched what certain clients needed to be true with documentation, thorough enough to survive scrutiny from attorneys who had not looked very hard. In 5 years, he and Briggs had worked 23 cases together. In 21 of those cases, the conservatorship had been granted. The numbers were not complicated. They were straightforward arithmetic, which was the kind of math Merritt preferred. Simple inputs, predictable outputs, a system that functioned reliably because it was built on the reasonable assumption that most families did not have the resources to challenge a board-certified Stanford psychiatrist with a published record and institutional backing. The Harmon case was the most valuable single transaction in their history. They ate and talked about other matters the way careful people discuss important things sideways rather than directly. And at the end of dinner, Merritt said only, "The hearing proceeds Monday the 17th. I am prepared." Good, Briggs said. They did not discuss the mechanic in Reading. They had decided independently that there was nothing to discuss. They were wrong about this. Slate called Rex Maddox at 11 that night. Rex was 72 and had been in the Hells Angels since before Slate had joined, which put his tenure at somewhere north of 50 years. His hands were scarred from engine work and bar fights and the long-accumulated labor of a life spent building things with his hands and occasionally destroying things with the same hands when the situation warranted it. He had a 1968 shovelhead that he had rebuilt 3 times and refused to sell for any price ever offered, and he lived 20 minutes outside Reading in a house that was 2/3 garage and considered this arrangement completely satisfactory. His voice when he answered was the voice of a man who had not been asleep. "Late," he said. "I need the brotherhood," Slate said. Rex was quiet. This was one of the things Slate valued most about Rex Maddox, the quality of his silences. They were not empty silences. They were the silences of a man who understood that some things required a moment before a response. "How many?" Rex said. "All of them," Slate said. "Everyone who still remembers what the patch means, what it actually means." He told Rex what he had told Doc Haynes, and he told him the rest that he had not told Doc, because Doc did not need all of it. He told him about Vera and the ranch, and the diagnosis, and the son, and the 10 days, and the 23-year-old promise between 2 Marines who had died keeping a different one. Rex listened without interrupting. When Slate finished, the line was quiet for long enough that the outdoor sounds of Redding, California at 11 at night were audible. A dog somewhere. A car on the highway heading north. "A Marine's widow," Rex said. "Her husband died in Desert Storm. Same day as my father. Same unit. Same minefield." Rex exhaled slowly. Then, with a certainty that did not require volume to carry its weight, "I will start making calls tonight." "How many can we get?" "By Monday morning," Rex said, "we will have every man in Northern California who still has his patch and remembers what it's for. Give me until the weekend. I will have a number." After Slate ended the call, he stood in the garage for a while longer. The lights were on, and the 2 panheads were there, his own perfect and waiting Vera's rusted, and beginning the 2 of them occupying opposite ends of the garage, like a before and after photograph of something that could be transformed with enough time and work and willingness to begin. He picked up his father's dog tag from the workbench and held it in his hand for a moment, the way he did when he needed to feel the weight of something real. Then he put it in his pocket and went to work on the plans. By Saturday morning, 15 men had gathered in the garage. They arrived in 1s and 2s through the evening engines, cutting off in the lot, outside boots on the concrete, the particular smell of leather and road that men who ride carry with them like a second skin. Their average age was 67. Between them, they had decades enough to fill a library and a combined history of bad decisions and honored commitments and the particular wisdom that only comes from having lived long enough to understand the difference between the two. Rex Maddox sat at the head of the improvised conference around Slate's main workbench. Beside him was Gage Whitlock, 58 years old, who had been a very good attorney until a moment in a San Francisco courtroom 9 years ago when a judge had said something about his client that Gage had considered both false and contemptible, and Gage's response to this had been physical rather than procedural, which had cost him his bar card. He had not stopped thinking like a lawyer. He had simply lost the formal permission to act like one. Whitlock had a laptop open on the workbench and a yellow legal pad covered in notes. "I have been through the California Probate Code sections governing conservatorship," he said without looking up. "Title 11 through Title 13. I have been through the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act and the applicable elder abuse statutes and the procedural requirements under California Rules of Court 7.1101 through 7.1106. The room was quiet. He looked up. "There is a procedural defect in the petition," he said. "Section 1821 of the Probate Code requires that the proposed conservatee be personally served with notice at least 15 days before the hearing date. The notice served on Vera Harmon was delivered 14 days before Monday the 17th. "1 day short," Slate said. "1 day short." Whitlock paused. "I filed an emergency motion this afternoon with the Sacramento Superior Court, arguing the defect and requesting either dismissal or postponement." He closed the laptop, which was the gesture of a man who had arrived at the part of his report that he did not enjoy. The motion was rejected at 4:15 this afternoon. The court ruled that the notice was substantial compliance with the statutory requirement and that postponement would not serve the interests of judicial economy. The room absorbed this in silence. "So we are still at Monday the 17th, Rex said. "We are still at Monday the 17th. Whitlock looked at Slate. "Which means we need something else. Something concrete and undeniable that a judge cannot rationalize around. Documentation, recorded communications, financial records, anything that establishes that the diagnosis is fabricated and that Briggs Harmon and Aldous Merritt have engaged in a conspiracy to commit fraud." "Where is that documentation?" someone said from the back of the room. "It is in Merritt's office," Slate said. The room understood what this meant. No one said anything immediately. These were not men who were unfamiliar with the implications of what he was proposing. Several of them had navigated implications of exactly this kind at various points in their lives, with varying degrees of legal consequence. They understood the calculation precisely. Fletcher Haynes, who had driven down from Shasta Lake and was sitting on a toolbox in the corner with his arms folded, said felony burglary. You get caught, you are looking at serious federal time. You are 68 years old. This is not a theoretical risk. I know what it is, Slate said. And even if you get the records, Whitlock said they are inadmissible. Illegally obtained evidence cannot be introduced in the conservatorship hearing. Then we don't introduce them in the hearing, Slate said. We introduce them somewhere else. Whitlock looked at him steadily. We leaked them, Slate said. Every news outlet in California. The San Francisco Chronicle. The Sacramento Bee. Every television station with a camera and a satellite truck. We make what Merritt and Briggs have been doing completely public 2 days before the hearing. We destroy their credibility in the court of public opinion before they ever get to set foot in front of a judge. And then we show up Monday morning with everything we have, and we make it impossible for anyone in that building to pretend they don't know what is happening. The room was quiet for a different reason now. Not uncertainty, assessment. Rex looked around at the men, the slow, deliberate survey of a man who has led things and knows how to read a room. Whatever Slate needs, Rex said, we are here. The meeting broke at midnight. Men went to their bikes in ones and twos engines, starting in the parking lot, taillights disappearing down the road into the dark. Rex was the last to leave. He stood by his shovel head with his helmet in his hand. I will have 97 confirmed by Sunday night, he said. I have already spoken to 9 chapter presidents across Northern California. When I explain what this is, they don't ask questions. They ask where and when. Slate looked at him. Rex put on his helmet. Don't get caught, he said and rode away. Friday night, March 14th, 11 o'clock. San Francisco's financial district at this hour was a canyon of glass and granite, in which the lights of offices left on for no one competed with the ambient glow of the city below, and the foghorn making its low periodic statement somewhere beyond the bay. The streets were not empty, but they were quiet, inhabited by the categories of people who inhabit financial districts late on Friday nights, the last of the week's workers heading to late dinners, the maintenance crews beginning their invisible labor, the security personnel conducting their rounds with the particular expression of people whose job has trained them to be alert and whose experience has trained them not to expect anything. Slate was wearing all black. He stood in an alley behind the building that contained Suite 307, the office of Dr. Aldous Merritt, M.D., and he checked his phone. The text from the man who had helped him identify the building's security architecture and who had not asked to be named in any future telling of this story read, cameras looped. 30 minutes starting now. Go. He pulled on thin leather gloves and walked to the service entrance. The cleaning crew supervisor who met him there was a man in his 50s with the expression of someone who had done several things in his life that he was not proud of and had arrived at a late career understanding that occasional further compromise was the price of certain ongoing arrangements. He held the key card like it was uncomfortable in his hand. 30 minutes, the man said. Then I need that back and you were never here. Slate took the card. Inside the building was the particular quiet of spaces that are occupied all day, and then abandoned, still holding the warmth and the residual presence of the hundreds of people who had been in it 16 hours ago and would be back in 12 more. The fluorescent lights hummed at their overnight level. Somewhere on an upper floor, the distant sound of a floor buffer moved in a slow, repetitive arc. He took the stairs. 3rd floor, Suite 307. The door was locked with a standard deadbolt. He had a set of picks in his jacket pocket that he had not used seriously in 15 years, and it took him 50 seconds to open the door, which was 40 seconds longer than it would have taken him in his 40s, and he was aware of this without finding it useful to dwell on. He went in and closed the door behind him. The office was what he had expected from a man who organized his professional life around the impression of credibility. Framed diplomas on the wall in gold-edged frames. A leather chair behind a mahogany desk that was too large for the room it was in. Bookshelves with the books arranged by height rather than subject, which told you something about the person who arranged them. A potted plant that was maintained by someone who came in once a week specifically to maintain it. He sat at the desk and opened the laptop. Password protected. He plugged in the USB drive he had been given by someone who also preferred not to be named, and the program on it ran its process and the screen unlocked in 40 seconds. He opened the file directory and typed a name, Vera Harmon. The file appeared. He opened it and read quickly. The diagnosis document was thorough in the way of documents prepared by someone who understood that the thoroughness would be the first thing examined by anyone looking to challenge it. Cognitive assessment results, structured observation notes, brain scan interpretations with appropriate clinical language, a longitudinal comparison that referenced two previous assessments that he was fairly certain had never actually occurred. It looked legitimate, too legitimate, the kind of legitimate that is assembled rather than arrived at. He kept looking. He found the subfolder 20 minutes in. It was nested 4 levels deep in the directory structure under a label that meant nothing at first glance, the kind of archival notation that someone scanning quickly would skip. He did not skip it. Inside were templates, diagnosis forms with blank fields for names and dates, form letters to family members explaining the assessment process and the recommended next steps, standardized cognitive test result documents with pre-filled interpretive language and spaces for patient-specific scores to be inserted. The templates were complete, professional. They had been used many times. And beneath the templates was a spreadsheet. He opened it. 23 rows. 23 names, each with an age, a date of assessment, a diagnosis, a notation of legal outcome, and $2 figures. The first dollar figure ranged from $50,000 to $155,000. The second ranged from 0 to several hundred thousand. The payment column and the success fee column. In the column that showed the conservatorship or guardianship outcome, 21 of the 23 rows read granted. He photographed the spreadsheet, then the templates, then the diagnosis form with Vera's name on it and its fabricated assessment results. His phone vibrated. 15 minutes. He went to the email application and searched for Briggs Harmon. The correspondence folder labeled with Briggs's initials contained 47 messages spanning 3 years. He scrolled quickly, photographing screens, reading enough of each to confirm the content. The pattern was clear and consistent. Cases identified, fees, negotiated assessments, delivered to specification, legal proceedings, coordinated outcomes tracked. One email stopped him. It was from Merritt to Briggs, dated 3 months prior, subject line consisting only of initials. The body of the email was brief and precise, the language of men who have communicated this way many times. Assessment complete per your specifications. Fee structure, as agreed, $75,000 base, plus 5% of realized property value upon successful transfer. Court documentation prepared. Note that the property value estimate from Cascade confirms $3.1 million acquisition. Your 5% totals $155,000. My partnership share of the development, yield to follow standard arrangement. Monday the 17th should be uncomplicated, given our history with Judge Hartford. He read the last sentence again. Our history with Judge Hartford. He photographed the email. He kept photographing, moving through the correspondence with the focused economy of someone managing time carefully until his phone vibrated again. 10 minutes. Leave now. He found the folder labeled with Cascade Development's name and opened it. Partnership agreements. Financial statements showing Merritt's equity position in the company. 4 years of distributions. The numbers were substantial. The pattern was clear. Every property that passed through a Briggs Harmon conservatorship case to a Cascade Development purchase put money in Aldous Merritt's pocket through his equity stake. It was not a doctor providing professional services for a fee. It was a system, a machine designed to identify elderly people with valuable property, fabricate the medical predicate for stripping them of their legal autonomy, and convert their assets into returns on a real estate investment. 23 families. He photographed everything he could find, and his phone vibrated a third time. 5 minutes. Security rotation in 7. Go now. He ejected the drive and closed the laptop and stood. He looked around the office once. At the diplomas, at the leather chair, at the plant maintained by someone who came in once a week, at the careful assembly of legitimacy that a man had constructed around himself like a structure, and inside that structure had operated something that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with predation. He went to the door. He heard the voices in the hallway a half second before the door handle moved. The security rotation was running early, not 7 minutes now. He was across the room before the thought completed itself. The window behind the desk, 3rd floor, a fire escape visible through the glass, the iron grating dark against the building's exterior. He picked up the desk chair, turned his face away, and drove the chair through the window. The glass went with a sound like a decision being made. He went through the opening onto the fire escape as the office door came open and someone said something sharp and urgent behind him. He went down the fire escape the way gravity and 68-year-old knees allowed, which was faster than caution suggested, but slower than youth would have managed. The last landing was 8 feet from the alley below. He dropped it without hesitation and landed and ran. 3 blocks. Then he stopped, pressing himself into a doorway, lungs burning with the specific fire of a body that has been asked to do something it can accomplish, but not without cost. Behind him, 2 blocks back, he could hear the radio traffic and the beginning of sirens starting up, that rising electronic wail of systems being activated. He pulled out his phone and called Rex. "It is done," he said between breaths. "I have everything, all of it." "You okay?" "Yes. But they know someone was there. I need to go." "Get out of the city," Rex said. "We will handle the rest." Slate pulled the battery from his phone and dropped the pieces in 2 separate drains, 2 blocks apart. Then he walked. Stayed in the shadows that the city provided in abundance, kept his pace unremarkable, worked his way through 6 blocks to the parking structure where his truck was on the 3rd level. He drove out of San Francisco across the Bay Bridge and did not exhale fully until Oakland was behind him. He drove north through the dark on 80, and then 5, the valley floor flat and black on either side, the mountains invisible in the distance, but present in the way things are present when you know they are there. Reading appeared in his headlights 2 hours later, small and honest in the dark. He drove to the garage and parked and sat in the truck for a moment without getting out. He had committed a felony tonight. He had entered a building without permission and taken photographs of private documents. If he had been caught at 68 years old with his history, the conversation about the rest of his life would have been short and its conclusion settled. He had not been caught. He had in his jacket pocket photographs of documents that proved 23 elderly people had been systematically robbed, that the man who had stolen from them had done so using a doctor who manufactured medical credentials the way a counterfeiter manufactures currency, that a judge who would hear the conservatorship case on Monday morning had a financial relationship with the company that profited from the theft. He had 3 days. He called Rex. "I need 97 people," he said. Monday morning, early, Sacramento. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Rex said, "I already have 93 confirmed. I will have the rest by morning." Slate got out of the truck and walked into the garage and stood between the 2 panheads in the dark without turning on the lights. He put his hand on his own bike, cold chrome in the cold March night. He put his other hand in his jacket pocket and found the dog tag. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Calloway, USMC, 1968 to 1991. He stood there for a while. Then he went home and sat on his porch with a beer he did not drink and watched the stars make their patient transit across the California sky, and thought about a man who had turned around in a minefield, and thought about what it meant to come back, and thought about Monday. Monday was 2 days away. The machine had been set in motion. It would not be stopped. Saturday morning arrived in Redding with the kind of clarity that follows difficult nights. The air washed clean and cold, the sky above the valley a shade of blue that had no ambiguity in it. Slate had not slept. He had sat on his porch until the stars faded and the eastern horizon began its slow negotiation with the coming day, and when the light was sufficient, he had gone inside and printed the photographs he had taken in Merritt's office onto the paper he kept for invoices and work orders, and then he had driven to the garage and arranged them on the workbench in the order that told the story most clearly. By 6 in the morning, 15 men were standing around that workbench reading. They read in silence, which was the right way to read what was on those pages. Rex Maddox read with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the expression of a man absorbing information that confirms something he already suspected about the world. Fletcher Haynes read with the careful attention of a physician examining evidence, his eyes moving slowly across each page, occasionally going back to reread a section. Gage Whitlock read fastest, his legal mind processing the documents the way it had been trained to process evidence, identifying the significant from the merely incriminating, understanding the architecture of what had been built and where its load-bearing walls were. When they had all read, the room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms are quiet when a group of people has arrived simultaneously at the same conclusion and is waiting for someone to say it first. Jesus said a man named Dorsey Plank, 64 years old, who had not spoken yet and who reserved speech for occasions that warranted it. "This isn't fraud, this is a business. Organized crime," Whitlock said. "RICO territory. This is the kind of documentation that brings down law firms." He looked at Slate. "You understand what this is?" "I understand what it is," Slate said. "What I need to know is whether it stops the hearing Monday." Whitlock was quiet for a moment, and the quality of his quiet was the quality of a man choosing how to deliver something that does not improve with softening. "Not directly," he said. "Not through the hearing itself. The evidence is inadmissible, illegally obtained. No judge can allow it to be entered into the conservatorship proceeding. Even if we walk into that courtroom Monday morning with every page of this spread across the petitioner's table, Hartford cannot legally consider it." "Then what was the point?" someone said from the back. Whitlock held up one hand. "I said it cannot stop the hearing directly. I did not say it cannot stop it at all." He looked at Slate. "The point is what we do with this before Monday. And the point is what we do in that courtroom that has nothing to do with these documents." Slate said, "Tell me." Whitlock had been thinking through this since he had read the first page. The structure of what he proposed was not complicated. It was the kind of plan that looks simple once someone has assembled the pieces and which depends for its success not on complexity, but on the willingness of the people executing it to commit completely and without reservation. We have 2 days, Whitlock said. We use them in two directions simultaneously. The first direction is public. We contact every news organization in Northern California. We provide them with the documentation we have. We do not tell them how we obtained it. We describe the pattern, the 23 families, the financial relationship between Merritt and Cascade, the correspondence with Briggs Harmon. We give them everything they need to run a story that will be on the front page of the Chronicle by Sunday morning and leading the local news by Sunday night. He paused. By the time Briggs Harmon and Aldous Merritt walk into that courthouse Monday morning, the entire state of California will know who they are and what they have been doing. Hartford will know. The court staff will know. The reporters will be on the courthouse steps before 9 o'clock. And in that environment, with that much scrutiny, with cameras recording every moment, the calculation for everyone in that building changes. The second direction, Slate said, the second direction is what we do inside the courtroom. Whitlock picked up a page from the stack and set it down again. I found something in my research Friday night, something about Hartford. Judge Diane Hartford has presided over 11 conservatorship cases in the past 4 years. 9 of those cases resulted in the conservatorship being granted. In 7 of those 9 cases, the property involved was subsequently sold to Cascade Development Corporation within 18 months. I pulled the corporate filings for Cascade. The board of directors is listed. One of the names is Thomas Hartford. The room absorbed this. Her husband, Rex said, her husband sits on the board of a company that has received 7 properties through conservatorship cases she has overseen. She has a direct financial interest in the outcome of any case that could generate another property for Cascade. She should have recused herself the moment this petition was filed. She didn't, Slate said. She didn't, Whitlock confirmed, which gives us grounds to demand her recusal Monday morning publicly on the record with reporters present. She cannot grant the conservatorship if she has recused herself. And if she refuses to recuse despite the conflict, we have grounds for an emergency appeal that will halt the proceedings pending review. Can you file that, Slate said. I am not a licensed attorney, Whitlock said, which means anything I file formally is going to have problems. He looked around the room. What I can do is stand up in that courtroom and say what needs to be said on the record loudly enough for every camera in the room to capture it. The formal legal challenges that follow can be filed by someone with a current bar card. But the moment in that courtroom, the moment of public disclosure, that requires someone willing to stand up and say the words. Slate said, that's where we come in. Rex looked at the 15 men around the workbench and then at Slate. How many brothers will be there Monday, he said. I will have the number Sunday night, Rex said, but it will not be 15. Good, Slate said. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon refining the plan, assigning responsibilities, making calls. Whitlock drafted the language for the recusal demand. Doc Haynes finalized his written evaluation of Vera's cognitive function, formal and precise, and written to withstand scrutiny. Rex coordinated with chapter presidents across Northern California, and the numbers that came back through the afternoon confirmed what the Brotherhood was when it was operating the way it had been built to operate. Sunday arrived, and Slate spent the morning with Vera at the old airstrip outside of town, the one the county had stopped maintaining in the 90s and which had since been absorbed into the scrubland, the tarmac cracked and patient wide enough to practice on without traffic or consequence. Vera rode the panhead. She was good now in a way that had surprised him across the week of lessons. Not because he had doubted her capacity, but because the speed of her development had exceeded what he would have predicted for anyone encountering a machine like this for the first time at 79. She had a quality of attention that made learning efficient. She did not anticipate what she had not yet been taught. She did not pretend to understand things she was still integrating. She asked questions that were precise and retained the answers completely so that she never needed to be told the same thing twice. She handled the machine with the care of someone who understood that the relationship between a rider and a motorcycle was a negotiation rather than a command, that the bike would give you everything it had if you approached it with honesty about your limitations and respect for its own considerable weight and will. They stopped on the far end of the airstrip where a stand of old oak trees had pushed through the cracked tarmac and claimed it back. The morning was warm and smelled of dry grass and distant water. Vera killed the engine and sat on the bike and looked out at the mountains in the distance. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Slate said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, whatever happens in that building, Cole. She stopped and started again. Whatever happens, you have already done what Corbett asked. You came. You stood up, whether it works or not. It will work, Slate said. She looked at him. It will work, he said again. Not because we have all the right pieces in the right places, though we do, but because the thing Briggs and Merritt built only works in the dark. Tomorrow we are going to turn every light we have on it. Vera looked at the mountains. Then she reached into her jacket and produced the tin box and opened it and removed the purple heart in its blue presentation case and held it for a moment in both hands. He earned this in 1989, she said, 2 years before Desert Storm. An incident in training that went wrong and Corbett made a decision that saved 2 men and cost him 3 months of recovery. He was embarrassed by the medal. He said he had only done what anyone would have done. I told him that was precisely the point. The medal was not for doing the extraordinary. It was for doing the ordinary thing when the ordinary thing required everything you had. She placed the tin box back in her jacket. That is what you are doing, she said. The ordinary thing, the thing that any decent person would do if they had the chance and the courage and the right reason. Slate said nothing for a while. Around them, the old airstrip was quiet, and the oaks moved in a slight wind, and the mountains stood in their permanent arrangement against the sky. Do you know what I have been most afraid of? He said. Tell me that I would do all of this, and it would not be enough. That the system would hold the way systems hold when the people inside them have enough money and enough connection and enough practice at holding. That we would show up Monday morning with everything we have, and they would look at it and file a motion and schedule another hearing and send Vera to Golden Horizons in the meantime because the provisional conservatorship allowed for it, and by the time the appeals were heard, the ranch would be sold and the damage would be done. Vera looked at him steadily. And now she said, Slate looked at the mountains. Now I think about 97 motorcycles, he said, and I think there are things that hold in the dark that cannot hold in that kind of light. They rode back together through the late morning, 2 motorcycles on the empty back roads outside Redding, the sound of the engines carrying out across the scrubland and the blue California sky above them, with nothing in it but a few thin, high clouds moving east. That night, Rex called at 10:15. 97 confirmed, he said. 97 bikes, 97 riders. Average age, 67. Combined military service across the group is over 400 years. They are coming from Redding, from Chico, from Sacramento, from Stockton, from as far south as Fresno. Some of them drove 6 hours today to be in position. They will meet at Capitol Park at 7:30 Monday morning. Slate was sitting on his porch in the dark with the beer he had not drunk 3 nights ago, replaced by a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Rex, he said. Don't thank me, Rex said. This is what we are for. This is the only thing that ever mattered about any of it. He hung up. Slate sat with the cold coffee in the dark and the stars above Redding, California, which on a clear March night were numerous and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the proceedings scheduled in Sacramento for 9 o'clock Monday morning. He thought about his father, 46 years old, 23 years of service, a promise made in a bar in Oceanside that he had intended to keep and had been prevented from keeping by a minefield in the Kuwaiti Desert on February 10, 1991 at 4:17 in the morning, California time. Slate was 68 years old and had been given 33 extra years that his father had not gotten, and he intended to use them. He went inside and slept for the first time in 3 days. Monday, March 17, 2024. He woke at 4 in the morning without an alarm because his body had been waking at 4 in the morning for enough years that it no longer required external instruction. He lay still for a moment in the particular dark before dawn and listened to the silence of Redding, and then he got up. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window with the mug in his hand and watched the dark outside begin its almost imperceptible shift towards something else, the eastern edge of the sky taking on a quality that was not yet light, but was the precondition of light, the night acknowledging that it had run its course. He took a shower and put on clean clothes, dark jeans, a dark shirt, and over that his leather vest with the patches that represented 45 years of a life lived according to a particular code. He stood in front of the mirror in the hallway for a moment and looked at the man in it. 68 years old, iron gray hair, face that had been through weather both atmospheric and otherwise, hands that were scarred and calloused and capable. He looked like what he was. He drove to the garage. The lights were on when he arrived, which meant he was not the first there. Rex Maddox was sitting on a folding chair next to the workbench with a cup of coffee that was better than Doc's, though not by much, and Fletcher Haynes was standing by the window looking out at the pre-dawn dark, and Gage Whitlock was at the workbench with his briefcase open and his papers arranged with the precision of a man who had spent decades caring about the order of documents, even after the documents were no longer his professional responsibility. Nobody said much. They drank their coffee, and Whitlock reviewed his notes, and Doc sat down and looked at his hands, and Rex looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has made his decision and is now simply waiting for the appointed time. At 6, Rex's phone produced a series of short notifications, and he glanced at it and said, "They are moving. Convoy out of Chico heading south. Convoy out of Redding heading south. Sacramento Brothers confirmed at staging area." At 6:30, Slate picked up his father's dog tag from the workbench, where it had spent the night, and put it in his chest pocket. He picked up Corbett Harmon's letter in its aged envelope and put it in his inside jacket pocket over his heart. He went to the rusted panhead in the corner and put his hand on the handlebars. "Soon," he said, though not to anyone in the room. Then he walked out to his own bike and started the engine, and the sound of it in the early morning air was the sound of intention, and the others followed him out and started their own engines, and they rode south towards Sacramento as the sun came up over the eastern mountains and filled the valley with the cold gold light of a California morning that had decided to be clear. Capitol Park in Sacramento sits across the street from the state capitol building, a square of trees and grass and monuments that the city uses as a civic lung. At 7:30 on this Monday morning, it was doing something it had not done in recent memory. It was full of motorcycles. They were parked in rows along the streets surrounding the park, 97 Harley Davidsons of various makes and years, their riders standing beside them or sitting on them, or gathered in small clusters with coffee from the carts that had materialized at the park's edges to serve the unexpected crowd. The noise of conversation was low and constant, the particular undertone of a large group of people who are focused and purposeful and not there for spectacle. Slate arrived at 7 and moved through the crowd and was met by handshakes and nods from men he had not seen in years, and men he had never met, and men whose names he knew from Rex's descriptions, and men whose faces he recognized from decades ago when they had all been younger and angrier and less certain of what mattered. Rex found him near the center of the gathering. "All 97, Rex said, every man confirmed." Slate looked around at the gathered brotherhood. Men in their 60s and 70s predominantly, though there were some younger and a few older. Veterans and sons of veterans, former tradesmen and retired cops, and men who had worked with their hands their whole lives. They wore their years with the ease of people who had stopped needing to apologize for them. Vera arrived in a taxi at 7:45. She stepped out with the tin box under her arm, and she looked at the gathered motorcycles and the gathered men, and she was quiet for a long moment, absorbing it. Then she walked to Slate and stood beside him and looked at the crowd. "Corbett would have loved this," she said. "He would have insisted on riding," Slate said. She almost smiled. Whitlock appeared at Slate's elbow. "It is time," he said. At 8:15, 97 Harley Davidson started their engines simultaneously. The sound was not merely loud. It was something that moved through the chest and the bones and the air itself, a collective voice made of steel and combustion and 45 years of accumulated miles. And it expanded outward from Capitol Park in every direction, and the people on the sidewalk stopped and turned, and the drivers on the streets pulled to the side without being asked, because there was something in that sound that did not invite being ignored. They moved in two perfect columns, taking the lanes of L Street and then 7th with the unhurried certainty of something that has calculated its own mass and determined that everything else will accommodate it. No speeding, no aggression, no performance. Just 97 men going somewhere. They had decided to go moving with the collective grace of people who have ridden long enough to think as a single organism. News helicopters appeared overhead within 4 minutes. The columns turned onto I Street, and the Sacramento Federal Courthouse came into view ahead, its granite facade looking in the morning light like something that had been designed to suggest that the things decided inside it were beyond the reach of the kind of men now approaching it on motorcycles. They parked along the street in formation engines, cutting off in a rolling sequence that moved from the front of the column to the back and left behind it a silence that was almost as impressive as the sound had been. Slate got off his bike. The courthouse steps were already populated. Court staff, attorneys with briefcases, and the slightly harried expressions of people whose Monday morning had not gone according to expectation. Reporters more than he had anticipated, drawn by the news leak that Whitlock had coordinated Saturday night, their cameras and microphones oriented toward the building and now swinging to take in the 97 motorcycles and the 97 men beside them. Vera was already at the top of the steps. She stood with the tin box in the composure of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific morning and has arrived at it with everything she intended to bring. Whitlock stood beside her with his briefcase. Doc Haynes stood slightly behind. Briggs Harmon was there too, with 3 attorneys whose suits collectively suggested a billing rate that would make most people briefly reconsider their life choices. He looked at the motorcycles and then at his attorneys and said something that the distance and the ambient noise rendered inaudible, but which his face made legible. Aldous Merritt stood at the top of the steps, looking at the crowd with the expression of a man whose confidence is load-bearing and who can feel for the first time in a long time something shifting in the structure beneath it. Judge Diane Hartford appeared in the courthouse doorway flanked by two bailiffs. She was 61 and carried the particular authority of a person who has spent decades being the most powerful individual in whatever room she occupied. She took in the scene in front of her with the controlled expression of someone who does not permit their face to communicate surprise, though what Slate could see even from 50 feet was that the control was requiring more effort than usual. "What is the meaning of this?" she said. Her voice carried. She had developed a voice over 20 years on the bench that carried without needing to be raised. Whitlock stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, "my name is Gage Whitlock, and I represent Ruth Vera Harmon in the matter of Harmon versus Harmon. I am here to file an emergency motion requesting your immediate recusal from this proceeding on grounds of undisclosed conflict of interest." Hartford's expression did not change, but something in her posture did, a degree of stillness that had not been there before. "On what grounds?" she said. "On the grounds that your husband, Thomas Hartford, serves on the board of directors of Cascade Development Corporation. That Cascade Development has contracted to purchase the property at issue in this conservatorship proceeding. That you have a direct financial interest in the outcome of this case through your household's equity position in a company that profits from the conservatorship being granted, and that you were required by California Code of Judicial Ethics Canon 3 to disclose this relationship and recuse yourself at the time this case was assigned to your calendar." The crowd on the steps had gone very quiet. The reporters were close now, cameras recording, microphones extended. Briggs Harmon's lead attorney stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is a transparent delay tactic coordinated by a disbarred attorney who has no standing to file motions in this court, and I would ask that these proceedings move inside immediately and that these individuals be cleared from the steps." "We have evidence," Whitlock said. He opened his briefcase. He removed the corporate filing documents showing Thomas Hartford's board membership at Cascade Development. He removed the 7 previous conservatorship cases under Hartford's jurisdiction and the subsequent property transfers to Cascade. He held them up not toward the judge, but toward the cameras, because the cameras were where the decision was actually being made this morning, and everyone on those steps who had spent any time in courtrooms understood this. "We have documented correspondence," Whitlock continued, "between Vincent Sullivan Harmon and Dr. Aldous Merritt, discussing the fabrication of an Alzheimer's diagnosis for financial gain. We have a spreadsheet maintained by Dr. Merritt documenting 23 elderly patients, 23 fraudulent diagnoses, and the fees paid for each fabricated assessment. We have financial records demonstrating that Dr. Merritt holds a significant equity position in Cascade Development Corporation, giving him a direct monetary interest in the properties his diagnoses helped transfer." Merritt's face had changed. The confidence that had been load-bearing was no longer holding the structure up. He looked, Slate thought, like a man who has built something and has just realized that someone has been inside it. Briggs Harmon took a step backward, a small involuntary movement, and his nearest attorney took his arm. "This evidence was obtained illegally," the lead attorney said loudly enough for the cameras, "through a felony break-in at Dr. Merritt's office Friday night. It is inadmissible, and its presentation constitutes obstruction of these proceedings." "We have forwarded copies to the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Whitlock said calmly. "They opened a preliminary inquiry Saturday morning." This was not precisely true. It was the kind of statement that was true enough in intent that Whitlock had decided it served the moment better than a more carefully qualified version would have. The FBI had received an anonymous package Saturday morning. What they had done with it was, as of this moment, uncertain. What was not uncertain was the effect of the statement. Merritt said something to Briggs in a low, urgent voice. Briggs did not respond. He was looking at the cameras the way people look at things that are making an irreversible record. Slate walked up the courthouse steps. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where he is going and is not asking permission to get there. And the crowd accommodated him in the way crowds accommodate people who carry themselves with that quality of certainty. He stopped in front of the cameras. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and removed an aged envelope and held it so the cameras could see the block printing on the front. Then he looked at Judge Hartford, and he spoke clearly in the measured cadence of a man who has thought carefully about each word and is not going to rush them. "My name is Slate Calloway," he said. "My father was Gunnery Sergeant Frank Calloway, United States Marine Corps. He served 23 years, and he died on February 10, 1991, in Desert Storm in a minefield near the Kuwaiti border. He died alongside Lieutenant Corbett Harmon, who was this woman's husband." He gestured briefly toward Vera without looking away from the camera. "Before they deployed, they made a promise to each other," he said, The kind of promise men make when they are about to go somewhere that they might not come back from. If one of them didn't make it home, the other would take care of the family left behind. Make sure they were okay. Make sure they knew they were loved. He held up the envelope. This letter was written by Lieutenant Corbett Harmon 2 days before he died. He addressed it to me, to the son of Frank Calloway. He asked me to do what they had promised each other, to take care of his family. He paused. Both of them died, so neither one of them could keep that promise. I am here to keep it for them. 33 years late, but I am keeping it. He looked at Hartford. And I am here to tell this court, on the record in front of every camera present, that Briggs Harmon has been trying to steal his own mother's property using a fraudulent medical diagnosis. That Dr. Aldous Merritt has been selling fraudulent diagnoses to families across Northern California for at least 5 years, enabling the systematic theft of elderly people's assets and their placement in care facilities against their will. That 23 families have been victimized by this operation, and that this court has on at least 7 previous occasions granted conservatorships that fed property directly to a development company in which the presiding judge's husband holds a financial interest. The steps were absolutely silent. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a very large number of people absorbing something simultaneously. Hartford was looking at Slate with the expression of a woman who has spent 20 years in positions of authority and is experiencing, perhaps for the first time, the sensation of that authority being insufficient to the moment. She looked at the cameras. She looked at the reporters. She looked at 97 men standing beside 97 motorcycles in the street below, and she looked at the crowd that had grown during the preceding minutes to several hundred people drawn by the helicopters overhead, and the sound of engines and the particular frequency of something significant happening in a public place. She looked at Briggs Harmon. Something passed across her face in that moment. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. The recognition of a person who has allowed themselves gradually and with many small rationalizations to become something they would not have recognized as themselves 20 years ago. She looked at her bailiffs. Get the FBI field office on the phone, she said quietly. Right now. Then she looked at Briggs Harmon and Aldous Merritt, and her voice when it came out was the voice of the bench. Not the voice of a woman doing a calculation, but the voice of a judge who has remembered belatedly, and not entirely too late, what the bench is for. Neither of you leaves this building, she said. Briggs moved. It was not a decision exactly. It was the reflex of a man whose whole professional life had been built on the skill of leaving situations before they became unmanageable, and his body executed the reflex before his mind could assess whether it was viable. He turned and took 4 steps toward the edge of the courthouse steps. 2 bailiffs were faster. They had him at the top of the steps, and the moment was caught by 6 cameras simultaneously and would be on every news broadcast in California by noon. Merritt did not run. He stood very still, the stillness of a man who has assessed the situation and determined that motion of any kind is no longer in his interest. And he looked at a point somewhere above and beyond the crowd with the expression of someone who is beginning the long internal process of revising the story they tell themselves about who they are. Hartford stepped back to the courthouse doorway and turned to face the crowd one more time. This proceeding is postponed indefinitely, she said, pending federal investigation into the matters raised this morning. The conservatorship petition is denied. Ruth Vera Harmon retains full legal authority over her own person and property effective immediately and without condition. She went inside. Vera closed her eyes. Slate was beside her, and he watched her face in the moment, after the words landed, the moment when 33 years of something compressed into the space between one breath and the next. She did not make a sound. She did not need to. What was happening in her face was beyond the vocabulary of sound. Then she opened her eyes, and they were wet but clear, and she looked at Slate with those blue eyes that had seen too much and remembered all of it. It is over, he said. She shook her head, and she was almost smiling. No, she said, it is just beginning. The FBI arrived within the half hour. They had not, it turned out, received a package Saturday morning. What they had received was a phone call Sunday evening from a federal prosecutor in Sacramento who had been watching certain patterns in Northern California conservatorship cases for 2 years without quite having the specific evidence needed to move. The phone call had given her the specific evidence. She had called the field office. The field office had sent agents. The arrests of Briggs Harmon and Aldous Merritt on the courthouse steps were formally made at 9:47 in the morning. The investigation that followed moved with the speed that federal investigations move when the documentary evidence is comprehensive and the prosecutorial motivation is high. Within a week, they had identified all 23 families. Within a month, they had charged 14 additional people connected to the operation, including 2 sitting judges who had approved conservatorship petitions, a nursing home administrator who had facilitated the placement of diagnosed patients, and 3 attorneys who had filed the petitions and known or had reason to know the diagnoses were fabricated. Judge Diane Hartford resigned her judicial position on the afternoon of March 17th. She was not charged. The prosecutors could not establish that she had known the specific fraud as opposed to simply having failed to disclose a conflict that should have required recusal. Her resignation was accepted without comment from the court system, which was itself the subject of ongoing review. The trial of Briggs Harmon took 8 months. He was convicted on 19 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial abuse, and grand theft. He was sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary. Dr. Aldous Merritt was convicted on 23 counts, 1 for each patient, including charges of corrupt medical practice that stripped him of his license permanently. He received 25 years. Cascade Development Corporation was dissolved following the seizure of its assets as proceeds of criminal enterprise. The $47 million in total value of the fraud was subject to restitution proceedings that would take 3 years to complete. On the day the last verdict was read, Vera Harmon was riding her panhead on a road through Shasta County with no particular destination and no schedule, which was exactly what the road had always been for. 3 months after the courthouse steps, the Harmon family ranch in Shasta County sat 22 acres under the California sky, the ponderosa pines standing in their old-growth patience along the property's northern edge. The meadow below them, moving in a wind that came down from the mountains and smelled of snowmelt and pine resin, and something that did not have a name, but that the people who knew it recognized as the smell of a place that has not been ruined. The main house, built in 1887 by Corbett Harmon's great-grandfather from timber, milled on the property, stood the way things stand when they have been built correctly and maintained with care. Its walls were thick and its roof was sound, and it had survived enough seasons to have stopped worrying about weather. 300 people gathered in the meadow below the house on a Saturday in June. The 97 men who had ridden to Sacramento were there with their families and their bikes parked along the ranch road in a line that extended further than the property gate. The families of several of the other 22 fraud victims were there, people who had spent varying amounts of time believing that the system that had stripped their loved ones of autonomy and property was simply the way the world worked, and that resistance was not possible. They were there because Vera had found them through the FBI's victim notification process and had called them personally one by one and told them she was sorry and that she was glad they were coming. Veterans organizations. 2 state legislators who had introduced elder fraud prevention legislation prompted by the case. Reporters who had covered the story and come back because the story was not finished. And Vera Harmon. She stood in front of all of them in the afternoon light of the Shasta County summer, and she told them what the ranch was going to become. She called it Harmon and Callaway Haven. It would be a retreat for veterans and their families, free of charge, always. 8 cabins would be built on the north end of the property using local timber and local labor. And there would be a workshop where men and women who needed to work with their hands could do that. And there would be trails through the pines, and there would be space and quiet and the specific mercy of a place that does not require you to explain yourself or justify your presence. Slate would run the mechanics program. He would teach motorcycle repair and general engine work to veterans who wanted to learn it because he had learned from his own life that there were people for whom working with engines was a form of medicine that no prescription could replicate. The crowd listened, and some of them cried, and most of them did not, which was appropriate because this was not an occasion for grief. It was an occasion for the kind of thing that comes after grief, the thing that grief makes possible when you do not let it have the last word. After Vera spoke, Rex Maddox stood up without being invited and said only the Road Guardians will be there whenever they are needed. This is not a one-time ride. This is what we do. The Road Guardians had incorporated as a nonprofit organization the week after Sacramento, 97 men filing paperwork at a kitchen table in Redding with a seriousness and attention to procedural detail that surprised the attorney who helped them do it and should not have. They worked with social workers and elder law attorneys to identify patterns of financial fraud targeting elderly people across Northern California, and in the first 3 years of their operation, they recovered $31 million in stolen assets and contributed to the prosecution of 22 additional fraud cases. They were their mission statement, noted with the brevity of people who do not enjoy mission statements, men who kept their promises. The day before the Route 66 ride, Slate stood alone in the garage in the early morning before the light had fully committed to the day. Both panheads were there. His own perfect after 48 years of his care, every component known to him by touch, every sound it made a word in a language he was fluent in. and Vera's which over the preceding months had been transformed by the work they had done together, every bolt replaced or cleaned and torqued, to specification the tank repaired and repainted in the original burgundy that photographs from 1963 showed on models of that year, the engine rebuilt from the cases up the leather seat, replaced with new leather that had been treated and broken in and would develop its own character over the miles ahead. It was, he thought, exactly what it should be. Not pristine in the way of a museum piece, ready in the way of a tool that is about to be used for the purpose it was made for. He picked up his father's dog tag from the workbench. He held it in his palm and looked at it the way he had looked at it every morning for 33 years. The metal was warm from his pocket. The words were worn but readable. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Calloway, USMC, 1968 to 1991. He stood in the garage with the two motorcycles in the morning light coming through the high window at its usual angle and the smell of oil and metal and the faint residue of decades of work done in this space. "We did it," he said. The words were quiet and directed at no one in the room. He put the dog tag back in his chest pocket over the place where the letter had been. Outside, he heard the sound of a motorcycle approaching. The particular note of a panhead engine, the distinctive rhythm that people who love that engine recognize the way they recognize a voice. Vera coming back from her morning ride. She had been riding every morning since October rain and cold, notwithstanding reclaiming the miles that had been owed to her for 33 years one morning at a time. The engine cut off, boots on the gravel, the creak of the garage door which he had been meaning to oil for 2 years. She stood in the doorway with the morning light behind her. 79 years old in the fall and carrying it the way she carried everything, which was to say, with a composure earned through a great deal of difficulty and a refusal to be defined by any of it. "Ready," she said. Slate looked at the two bikes. For what he said, he knew what she was going to say. "Route 66, she said. "Chicago to Los Angeles, 2,448 miles. Corbett promised me that ride 35 years ago." She looked at him steadily. "Tomorrow we leave." When he said, "Dawn," she said, "if you are willing." He looked at his bike, at her bike finally what it was supposed to be after 35 years of waiting, at his father's dog tag in his chest pocket, which he could feel there the way you feel things that have been part of you long enough to have become part of you. He looked at her. "I am willing," he said. The next morning, two 1963 Harley-Davidson panheads rolled out of Redding, California, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains. The air was cold and the valley was still, and the road ahead was empty and straight and stretched north toward the interstate that would take them east toward Chicago, and the beginning of a route that two people had been waiting to ride since 1989. Behind them, after a moment, the sound began. 97 engines, starting not simultaneously but in sequence one by one, each one joining the growing voice of the thing until the sound was complete and whole and moving. The road guardians fell in behind the two panheads in their double-column riding escort for a promise that had waited longer than most of them had known each other. They rode east through the California morning into the light. The road ahead was long. It was exactly long enough. Somewhere in the particular place where Marines go, when they have done everything they came to do, two men who had served together and died together and had been separated from the promises they made only by the bad luck of where they had stood on a February morning in 1991, watched the column of motorcycles head east into the growing day. And what they felt, if the dead feel anything, was not grief for what had been taken from them. It was the particular satisfaction of men who kept their word, seeing their word kept. It was enough. It was perhaps exactly enough.